Tonight, the power and appeal of Shakespeare, from the classroom to the theatre and in modern life. How relevant is his work today when it comes to our standards of life and leadership? And does his voice dominate at the expense of others? Welcome to Q&A. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Stan Grad. We're coming to you live from Sydney tonight. Joining me on the panel, satirist and entertainer Paul McDermott, writer, actor and director Nakkiah Lui, founding artistic director of Bell Shakespeare, John Bell, author, academic and activist Bri Lee, and philosopher and author Tim Dean. Wonderful to have you all here in the room. And remember, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials as well. Quanda, as usual, is the hashtag. Please join the debate. We publish your comments on screen from Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. Let's get to our first question tonight. It comes from Marriotttville High School.
This question is particularly directed to Mr. John Bell, but also all of the panel members.
As members of the Marriotttville High School's Shakespeare Club, we are interested in the power and appeal of Shakespeare and his works and their influence today.
How do you think Shakespeare's themes and influence still resonate with our contemporary society? And what are your views on why or whether Shakespeare remains relevant to study in schools?
And what makes Shakespeare so popular and lasting compared to other early modern playwrights like Christopher Marlowe?
John, I know the question was directed to you, but I'll get you to hold the thought. Nakkiah.
Oh, well, I'd go to Mr. Bell a little bit in theatre or as a nerdy playwright. No, but I think, you know, the man's still being produced after 400 years. That's quite the career. This is my second panel on Q&A talking about Shakespeare. So I think the question about whether or not Shakespeare is relevant, I think that's a resounding yes. Over 400 years has proven that man is relevant.
Do you wonder sometimes what Shakespeare would be thinking 400 years later, they're still talking about me?
I was wondering about that. I think the question we should be asking is, why are we asking if Shakespeare is relevant? And in an age where we're discussing new ideas and hearing from voices that have been traditionally, historically, not embraced and marginalised, what are we hoping to seek by looking at the work of Shakespeare and not new voices? Yeah. That's something I ponder about. And given that Shakespeare's, he had such imagination, he was obsessed with new ideas, dissecting power structures and culture, would Shakespeare be saying, hey, stop studying me, take a chance on a brand new kid or something?
We're going to get to that. John, let's go back a bit. And what was it about Shakespeare that grabbed you and when?
I was about 13 years old, I think, and listening to the ABC radio and hearing Ron Hedrick playing Brutus in Julius Caesar. I'd never heard Shakespeare before, and that grabbed my attention, extraordinary voice and the imagery that was, coming to me. And then in high school, I had two wonderful English teachers, two wonderful men who knew they loved literature, poetry, Shakespeare in particular, and they really, loved the work so much that it really inspired something in me, and I wanted to get up on stage and speak those words. So it was, I think, a great teacher will not only inspire you, but actually can set your life's course, as those two men did for me, and I'm eternally grateful for that.
Paul, I understand you had a more painful experience of an introduction to Shakespeare in high school. Is that
we're going there, are we?
Are we going there?
All right.
We've done our research, Paul.
This was a chat I was having with someone, and it's interesting that it's come up. But certainly, when I was in, I think it was year 8, could have been year 9, we were reading Julius Caesar, and we were told by the teacher to go outside into nature and read the book out, in one of the fields, paddocks around our schools or on the oval or something. I don't know why that was. I don't know if it was so we could commune with the elements and get a deeper understanding of it, but we were on the oval. I was there with a couple of mates, and they were, they were friends of mine. I consider them friends, but at one stage, two of them grabbed my legs and splayed me across this small little hill that we were sitting on, and another friend of mine looked at his copy of Julius Caesar and flung it at my groin at speed and cracked me on the nuts with Julius Caesar's spine. I don't think I ever finished the book after that. I was so...
But you've never forgotten Shakespeare.
I've never forgotten it, yeah. Shakespeare's spine
Tim,
stays with me.
One of the things about Shakespeare, of course, is that he's one of those people credited with... Harold Bloom said this, didn't he, that the great critic, that he invented the modern human, if you like, that he's part of the invention of modernity. And as a philosopher, what do you draw from him?
Look, I don't know if he invented the modern human, but I think he does speak to something about human nature. I mean, that's what I'm interested in. And when I, read or watch Shakespeare, I see those elements of human nature there. But he's talking from a kind of a particular period in kind of history. And I think there's not as much universality there as we might think. We think about, like, modernity, or we think about, the way that humans have been over the last few hundred years. But we've got to remember, we are a species that is hundreds of thousands of years old. Now, he does tap into some aspects of the human condition that are timeless, but there's a lot that he is missing out. He did touch on something that I think emerged from that kind of agricultural, large-scale living, the concentration of the resources, the inequality, the power structures. Some of those kinds of elements there, I think, are very, very rich there, but I don't know if it's quite universal.
Bri, John's made this point, and Tim says there are things that are left out. There's a hell of a lot of society before Shakespeare picks up a pen, but it was an extraordinary range of work, wasn't it? The breadth and depth of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are two separate arguments here. One is the sort of out in the real world, where I believe that good art can foster a further desire and hunger for more good art. And then there is the educational setting, where it's very much a zero-sum game. So what do I mean by that? If we go see paintings that move us, or if we go see theatre that makes us laugh and cry, we're more likely to go to more exhibitions. We're more likely to go out and buy more tickets to more plays. The thing that concerns me, and to sort of pick up where Nakkiah just left off, is that for every single time you fight for the inclusion of one of Shakespeare's plays to be taught, that is fighting for the exclusion of Anne Chuli King or a Kate Mulvaney or a Nakkiah Lui play. There are only a certain number of semesters and a certain number of texts that students can be taught every year.
And that is a great segue and opens up a discussion that our next questioner is going to raise as well.
Shakespeare's plays make up a huge proportion of productions put on by Australia's leading theatre companies, usually about one per season per year. Given that there are already so few coveted spots available for other playwrights, what's the value of restaging Shakespeare's work over and over when we could be hearing from other voices?
John, you talked before about your introduction to Shakespeare and what grabbed you. And I want to ask what it was that took you to England to seek that out, and what you didn't see in 60,000 years of story that was already here in Australia. Just to this question of voices that are not heard, the voices that are not heard here, the Iliads and the Odysseys that have been written here over 60,000 years. Did that not speak to you, and Shakespeare did?
Stan, 60 years ago, when I was 20 and heading off to England, the voice of the First Peoples was non-existent. It didn't happen. They were invisible. We never heard their stories. We saw a little bit of their art, but mainly on tea towels. It wasn't in any galleries. We were woefully unfamiliar with Indigenous peoples' art, history, culture, even their presence. So, as a young actor, there wasn't much of an industry happening here, and everybody of my generation headed off to England. People like Clive James, Germaine Greer, all that generation, many of them stayed there. People like Bruce Beresford, myself, came back. But that's where you went to work, and the theatre that was available was, of course, English theatre. And most of the theatre being done in Australia was English theatre or American theatre. There were very, very few Australian plays. Maybe one every 2 to 5 years, an Australian play would hit the stage. We were fed Broadway and West End hits and the occasional Shakespeare or Molière or Chekhov. That was the diet. And it's only very recently, we have to remember, that the Indigenous voice has begun to be heard and their presence acknowledged.
Do you feel that that is a story that you can engage with, is your story, as much as, say, Shakespeare, maybe?
I'm sorry, I don't know.
An Indigenous story here, would you feel that that is a story that is a tradition that belongs to you as well as Shakespeare?
I think we are being invited to share Indigenous culture now and to come on board and enjoy it and invite Indigenous writers to contribute to the repertoire, which is happening more and more, of course, not only on stage but in television and film. It's a phenomenon. It's over the last maybe 10 years that has begun to be so significant.
Nakkiah.
I would disagree, respectfully. I think that, you know, what's the saying? Is it Toni Morrison who says white innocence is white supremacy? Aboriginal people were here. We've been telling our story for over 60,000 years. And in fact, theatre was such a part of the civil rights movement within Australia, the National Black Theatre. It was used as a means to have dissidents when, you know, back in the 60s and the 70s. I think if we were to go to say, hey, look, we didn't know back then, we weren't aware of Aboriginal culture and we're just coming on board now, which I disagree with. I think Aboriginal people, people of colour, marginalised people have had to fight incredibly hard to be heard and to be seen. It's not a phenomena at all. And the things that I say in my plays are just continuations of what knowledge I've been handed down generationally. But if let's say we were to go with what you're saying is we all went overseas, we didn't know. Shouldn't we then be saying, okay, maybe the trying to see if Shakespeare is relevant and trying to say these themes are universal as opposed to going, hey, no, we're just very empathetic and we're able to see ourselves in our work. Maybe then do we go, let's start investing in the voices of Australia. Why not start investing in more First Nations voices, in young people, in playwrights that are emerging?
How do you feel about that question, Nakkiah, about who gets to write that story? Because, you know, I speak to a lot of white Australian writers who say, well, that's not really my story to tell, or they're reluctant to enter that story, or feel as if it may be fraught or appropriating someone else's story. Is that a tradition that belongs equally to John as Shakespeare does to you and I as well?
Do you mean in terms of engaging with Aboriginal
engaging
content?
with or writing it, performing it?
Well, I think when it comes to First Nations voices, we should be being able to tell our own stories because historically we haven't been able to. There's so much power in being able to tell your story and have a voice. And taking away people's voice is something that Australia has historically done to oppress Aboriginal people and is still, one could argue, a form of colonialism that is happening today. I don't quite necessarily understand the question, but what I do think is that everybody has the capacity to hear. You know, going back to are Shakespeare's themes universal? I would say actually no. Shakespeare isn't necessarily universal, it's that empathy is timeless and we're willing to listen to each other. So I think the question is, like, anyone can be willing to listen. Are people who would traditionally hold Shakespeare in reverence, are they willing to listen to and give merit to cultures and voices that don't necessarily speak to their background or their culture or their history or upbringing?
I think we are really trying very hard now to enter that conversation and to hear those voices and to encourage Indigenous writing. I think this is very much part of the theatre industry's responsibility, and I think it is answering that call.
Yeah, to an extent, but over the last 2 years, there's been major cuts to the theatre industry. You know, people say that theatre is dying, and I wonder if actually theatre isn't dying, we're just not evolving because we hold things like Shakespeare as to such reverence that it's become a tenet of our culture. Whereas it's not a tenet of our culture, it's a really good part of it. But let's explore and give power to others.
Yes, but
sorry, John.
I don't think that there's an excess of Shakespeare being done in our state theatre companies. The Sydney Theatre Company might do one every couple of years, but it's not like it's sucking up all the air or taking up all the spaces anywhere around the country. It's actually much more.
It's fair to say too, Nakkiah, your work is being performed, which is a good thing.
Yes, but we need more. There's been major cuts across especially youth sector, mid-sector, new work. And, you know, there is a whole theatre company devoted to Shakespeare, Bell Shakespeare. They're getting, you know, a whole new studio built, whereas,
there's also,
you know, a lot of companies
are... for instance?
I think it's one. I think it's about, like, whose voices are we hearing? And at the moment, there's been such cuts to art funding. Lots of arguments for Shakespeare to, you know, like, have young people embrace it. But there's been massive cuts, especially to youth theatre.
And Bri, that goes to what a lot of you've talked about, and that is an elitism or a capture of Shakespeare as part of elitism or power, the capture of knowledge by a few. Shakespeare didn't start out as an elitist. His father was essentially a bureaucrat, a public servant. He performed plays for masses. How has it been captured by an elite? Why is it now seen as being elitist?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it is interesting to reflect on how, when his works were being written and shown in that immediate context, that was very much a form of entertainment for the masses. Whereas now it's pretty much undeniable that the way Shakespeare is often put on is sort of, the audience demographic is closer to those who would enjoy opera than it is to those who go to films and enjoy actual mass forms of entertainment. And I would like to take this question and just sort of reshape it slightly and punt it over to John, if I may, which is that I know you've worked previously with the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilization. And for those who don't know, that's an organisation who give an extraordinary amount of money to a very small number of people, and it's people who really, really like Western civilization. And the organisation is run by people who set a tone that not only is Western civilization really great, but in many ways it is the best. And I would actually like to hear from you, who is a man who has spent the better part of his life thinking deeply and in nuanced ways about William Shakespeare. How does it make you feel to work with people and to know that there are people who exist who use Shakespeare as the poster boy for the supremacy of Western civilization?
Can I just say, before I hear from John, Ramsay, of course, is a group that was involved in funding a course in Western civilization, among other things, that attracted a bit of criticism.
Bri, I don't actually work for the Ramsay organisation. I did give one question and answer conversation at an event once for them. That's my connection with the Ramsay Centre. I think that students and all of us should be involved with as broad a spectrum of culture as we can. I'd say going back to the turn of the century, English culture particularly dominated our cultural landscape, then followed by European culture. But since then we've had, much more investment with cultures from the rest of Europe and Asia. And all this feeds into our national culture now. All these different streams are now feeding into who we say we are as Australians. I don't think that we should be holding up any particular culture as being the dominant or the superior one. They all have marvellous things to offer. I'm thinking of the arts of Southeast Asia particularly, who are our close neighbours.
But Shakespeare is used as the poster boy, right, for Western civilization being the best?
No, I don't agree with that. I'd say Michelangelo or Beethoven or, Van Gogh. I mean, you can take your pick about poster boys for Western civilization.
They're all white.
Well, we
so universal.
Hold that thought. There's a lot more to discuss about that. Our next question comes from James Bartolome.
In The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare draws the character Shylock through a prism of anti-Semitism. Given that this play was a favourite of the Nazi regime, could it be said that Shakespeare was anti-Semitic, as many historians believe? If so, why was this play written in such an anti-Jewish way when his other works were not?
John, this is tonight. All questions, all Shakespeare questions end up with John. But how do you defend against that accusation?
Having played Shylock myself 3 times, and finding him a deeply sympathetic character who I very much enjoyed investigating and performing, I'd say it's a play about anti-Semitism. It's not anti-Semitic in itself. It's a play about a culture that is racist and anti-Semitic and a white exclusive culture, and Shylock has been locked out of it. And Shakespeare gives him the floor and to justify what he wants to do, because he's been so persecuted and vilely abused by this particular culture. And Shylock, to me, is the dominant character in the play. He comes out as being wronged and abused and vengeful for very good reasons. So I've done a lot of research into Shylock, and when I performed it, and I find it a very sympathetic and very playable role. And many Jewish actors, of course, great Jewish actors, have enjoyed playing him for the same reason.
Paul, it's like so much of art or writing. It is what you take away from it. Is it a case of interpretation? Is it, as some say, that it is mocking a particular stereotype of a Jewish person, or is it shining a light into anti-Semitism? What's your reading of it?
Well, I think that art is a question. There's no immediate answer in art. That a football match, you have someone that wins. With maths or science, you have, definite truths. But with art, it's a question. It's what the audience takes away from it and what they glean from it. So I totally understand how, as the boy was saying, that the Nazis could take Shylock and do it as an anti-Semitic.
And it was performed dozens of times during the Nazi regime, the lead up to World War II.
It was, but the text was very heavily cut.
It was.
So that anything sympathetic to Shylock was cut, and he was presented as a caricature. So it was not Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice that was being showed. It was Joseph Goebbels' version of it that was being displayed.
But really, any time you say anything, it can be interpreted by someone else and seen in a different light and be used to suit their purposes. So,
and Tim, let's go to what Shakespeare said. One of the immortal lines: "Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions?" It goes to what you write about, isn't it? It's about finding a commonality in human beings rather than focusing on difference. Is that what you believe that Shakespeare was trying to do?
Well, look, I mean, I should preface this by saying I'm not a Shakespeare expert by any stretch, but I think by that reading, there's certainly a hint of the kind of universal humanity there, but I don't want to read too much into it. And I don't want to necessarily forgive Shakespeare for what we would today call a stereotypical or a problematic depiction of somebody. And if we generalise it to any kind of media that is produced in a different time, in a different kind of moral landscape, in a different kind, with different kind of moral norms, I don't think we need to... we can perhaps forgive an artist working within that framework for conforming with the norms of that framework, but we certainly shouldn't forgive the content of that framework. We certainly shouldn't look at it today and forgive that depiction necessarily. If there's a problematic depiction somewhere, we should call it out for what it is. And art is not just descriptive. It's not just saying, here it is. There's always a kind of a normative quality to it. There's always something to say should, not just is. There's something to say this is how we should look at something. And so we can still, I think there's still value in engaging with work that does have problematic aspects. We've got to do it critically. We've got to do it in the context. We've got to understand that cultural and kind of moral milieu. We've got to be able to critique that. But if we just lift it out and drop it in and say that it's either OK by today's standards or not OK, we're not really doing justice to the way we engage with it.
But Nakkiah, this is what happens time and time again. There's a case recently in the United States where a University of Michigan professor had shown Laurence Olivier's depiction of Othello in blackface. He's had to apologise, had to stand down from his position. Should we be cancelling people or people losing their jobs for showing a performance of Olivier performing Othello?
Well, I'm not familiar with that situation, but going back to what you were saying...
But certainly familiar with this. This is certainly the environment.
Look, I think it's a bit of a dog whistle, though, to be like, is cancel culture going to come after William Shakespeare? I mean, honestly, I think the guy can stand up to a little bit of criticism. I think it's really important for us to criticise the context in which and criticise the content of the work. And I guess one of the things that consistently happens with Shakespeare, going back to what you were saying, Tim, is that I guess the privilege that he has that a lot of work doesn't, is that we kind of take it out of context and hold it in reverence as if it's the gold standard. And so often I find when watching Shakespeare, like let's say something like Othello, for instance, you see these really gross representations of people of colour. And as an audience member, and also you see it with actors, they're having to perform these mental backflips in order to have it to be relevant today. And I think that's the issue, is that with other work that we can go, oh, it's problematic, but should we still examine the art? Let's not cancel it, let's not censor it. It's kind of not the question. Going back to with Shakespeare, it's that we kind of don't look at the context. We hold it, as I was saying, this gold standard, and we just don't question it.
Leads to our next question, which comes from Ruby Wong.
Some critics now view as problematic unnecessarily bringing up the role of slavery in the lives of popular historical figures when simply responding to a painting about them. Does historic art, including classical literature and film, exist in a vacuum where we cannot and should not be critical of the subject matter for fear of unfairly imposing our progressive views on traditional art?
Tim Dean, does anyone escape censure? I mean, one of your great philosophical heroes is David Hume, a great thinker of the Scottish Enlightenment. One of the thinkers that gave birth to the modern world, who there is a debate now about whether he should be cancelled effectively.
Yeah, there's been a debate for a little while at the University of Edinburgh, which has a building named after David Hume. And they're talking about renaming that building to someone else. And the reason is that there's one footnote in his work that is explicitly racist towards people of African descent. And this raises a kind of a difficult thing. It's similar to what I was talking about with Shakespeare as well. In a way, Hume should be criticised for his views there, but also he was speaking in a way that was consistent with the views of his time. So there needs to be an understanding of the kind of context in which we would criticise him. Are we criticising him based on the content of what he said in his world or today? And the other question is, what implication does that have upon the rest of his philosophy? And it's complicated because the legacy of thinkers like David Hume, and I mean, you name it in terms of the Western philosophical tradition, predominantly white men, they usually held racist or sexist views among other kind of views that are problematic, absolutely despicable today. But they also laid the foundations that enable us to critique those same views today. So it's not as complex as saying I'm not saying the University of Edinburgh is going to cancel David Hume, but there's a gesture towards diminishing his status. But if we diminish that status and we lose those lessons on the way, we could also lose the very tools that we use to critique the content of what they're talking about as well.
Bri?
Yeah, I just get frustrated when people talk about cancelling as though that means one thing and that it's forever and actually has any kind of significant impact. If you actually really lose your job, your ability to sort of continue within your profession and your works are sort of erased from the history books, that's what actual cancelling looks like. People use cancel when what they mean is accountability. And we are living in an exciting age where individuals and works are held accountable and held up to scrutiny in a way they weren't previously. And that is a good thing. Something I get accused of all the time is what is it? Is it presentism? When you judge people in the past or works from the past by standards of today. But we are all capable of holding two ideas in our hands at once, and hindsight is a gift.
That's a really interesting point. But Paul, do you find that we live in a world where people don't hold two views? We retreat to our camps, and particularly on social media you see this, where it becomes a pile-on or abuse, that we're not holding a nuanced view.
Well, I mean, it's been written about many times, the echo chamber of social media, and certainly that happens. I certainly agree with Bri, though. It's about accountability, and it should be accountability across the board in social media as well. A lot of people are getting away at the moment with just saying extraordinary things, very insightful things, inflammatory things, not based in fact at all, and there needs to be accountability.
And John, when it comes to analysing Shakespeare and David Hume or any of these figures, there are the things that you can find that are going to be troubling or offensive, and then there are things, of course, that are incredibly illuminating or inspiring. I mean, you can have the founding document of the United States claiming that all men are created equal, men, the language of the time, but people created equal, an aspiration of equality written by slaveholders. Is it a case of being able to put things in context, look at those things in their entirety? But do you feel as though we're losing that capacity today?
I think we are getting away from it a bit. I think, as Bri said, we can hold two ideas at once. We can admire a painting or an opera for its beauty and its skill, and still find things in it that one could say are offensive. But I mean, so what's wrong with being offended now and then? And you don't get damaged by it. You can say, I can see that in its context. That's a rather sexist thing to say, or that's a rather
But sexism does cause damage. Racism does cause damage.
But you don't go out and start committing offences because you've just seen The Marriage of Figaro or something like that. You can take on board that there is a certain sort of sexist underbelly to the opera. But does that actually cause damage? Does that actually make you go and offend somebody? I don't think so. We can still appreciate a work for its beauty and see it in its time and say that was then, and I can still enjoy it now, putting aside whatever moral development or shifts there have been. Not forgetting that those moral ideas and shifts will happen tomorrow and the next day, and we won't have the same values today as we will have in 10 years' time. We'll have shifted ground again. And so it's a bit limiting to confine ourselves to this is the absolute truth, and that is fixed forever, here and now.
I would disagree and say that when we constantly see reproductions of ableism, of sexism, of racism, it very much creates and perpetuates a culture, a fabric of existence amongst which we all move on a daily basis. And I don't see a binary or a line between sort of what metaphorical damage and real damage. And also, yes, we're all capable of holding two ideas at once. But what I would like to say is if we're renaming buildings and if we're choosing what gets put on our curriculum, why not pick things that have all of this nuance, that have all of this empathy, encouragement, and not racism and sexism? Because there is such good work being made from all corners of the globe by all different types of people. It's just frustrating. We do the same thing over and over again.
Let's go to our next question from Zoe Booth.
Australia, much like the United States, has reached a moment in which to be proud of being Australian or to show any spark of patriotism is seen as alt-right. How are we going to move on and improve the lives of all citizens, regardless of their backgrounds, if we are not united by a positive sense of self?
Paul, it's an interesting question from Zoe, but do you accept the premise that to express patriotism is to belong to the alt-right? Is there a place for patriotism that is not hijacked by a particular
I think there's a lovely aspect of love of country, but when it turns into a nationalistic sort of fervour, or it's and often with patriotism, I've always sort of been a person that's been offended by people wrapping the Australian flag around themselves. I don't know why that is. I just find it a bit of a statement.
Would you feel comfortable to say, I'm a proud Australian?
I'm a proud Australian, yeah. And I think we have a gift of a country here. It's an extraordinary country. And, but, of course, there are the dark forces that are moving within this country at the moment. And I think there's been massive influence from America over the past, 5, 10 years. And we do have a growing problem, but it's not just in Australia, it's globally, with the alt-right. And I find them unbearable because they don't allow thoughts, and they're not comfortable with differing opinions. So it's a very belligerent and aggressive tone that I think a lot of the alt-right adopt with people.
Nakkiah, we've been talking a lot about critique of the West and the baggage of the West, and I was just wondering what are the things about the West that inspire you, that you're proud of and that are worth preserving?
Stan, I'm not answering that question. I don't think that the West is at any risk at all of anyone because a few people get up and criticise some of its great works of art and go, hey, this is a little bit offensive. I feel rather marginalised and I don't feel like I have a place in this society. Maybe we should reconsider whether how we look at this work. I don't think that's. I think that question is quite divisive. But we live in the West every single day. And speaking of what you're saying, Paul, would I call myself a proud Australian? I'd call myself a proud First Nations person. I'm on land that was never ceded. This land is not a gift. It was land that was stolen because homes were destroyed and people were killed. So gift from the West, I don't know what you want me to say to that other than be like, hey, it wasn't so bad that invasion happened. However, in saying that, going to the question that was asked by that young lady, in terms of, I think so often we look at our backgrounds as being a hindrance to some type of equality, and that in order to be a good Australian, you have to forget about your things like your gender, your race, your culture. Anything that makes you different is somehow an obstacle to being a good Australian. So I would question when we go, the spirit of nationalism, what is that nationalism? Who does that person look like that we're all meant to be celebrating and replicating? But I'm not going to answer what I think is great about the West. That's like being like, you're lucky we gave you iPads. Look at you on your Facebook with your dissent. No, I'm not answering.
It's not what's great about the West, but to go to Bri's point about holding two views at the same time, is it a fact that a Western tradition that is complicit in empire and colonisation and genocide and the things you've talked about is also something that has created liberalism, democracy, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. Are those things not
But
worth
have they
preserving?
created it, though? The question is, I wouldn't say that people are trying to stop freedom of speech because we are wanting to engage with our freedom of speech. You can't on one hand go, oh, there's a whole marketplace of ideas, and then when some people then use whatever platform they have to argue with those ideas, go, oh, well, the marketplace is rigged and you're cancelling us. That isn't fair. And I don't think that, this idea of modern history, democracy, it's the names that we, freedom of speech, are this inheritance of Western culture that does a real disservice to all of the cultures that weren't impacted by the West and what preceded them. I think that like within Aboriginal culture, that's a big generalisation, so I'm sorry to probably my parents who I offended saying that, but you look at all the different tribes, all the different nations, they all have their own values. So to think that thought originated from one particular race at one particular time is so incredibly ignorant to me. But of course I think people are capable of duality. I think more than any time where we're wanting to, especially, with the pandemic that hit, our capacity for empathy, our capacity to want to get to know our neighbour, just because we get upset at each other and we have dissenting opinions doesn't mean we're not capable of thought or we aren't well fleshed out human beings. Like that is like, I just find that question really, like, that's a little bit divisive. And
that goes to your book, actually, Tim, doesn't it? Because you're talking about how we have just these types of conversations with all of the historical legacy, with all of the contradiction, with the philosophical thought that gave birth to this, that is problematic, as you've already pointed out. So how do we do this?
I think this is a good example of how we do this. We sit and listen to each other. But what makes it really difficult is we can hold two ideas at once, but we're not very good at it. We're much better at holding one idea. And not only just holding one idea, we're much better at holding an idea that others someone. So we've got a negative who we can push back against. And that can kind of help reinforce and buttress our identity. And I mean, talking about like the marketplace of ideas, I used to really be a believer in the marketplace of ideas, right? I used to teach critical thinking and, hey, everyone, if we can just do some better Venn diagrams, we can have some better conversations like this. And I realised it wasn't working because all I was doing, the students were weaponising this stuff to have bad conversations, to have bad arguments by throwing fallacies in people's faces or finding a way to kind of bring them down and win an argument. And I think what I've learnt a lot in the last few years, and particularly through writing the book and looking at human nature and looking at how we create our identities and how identity is so much socially constructed and how we create these others and the difficulties of us kind of getting out of some of that in-group, out-group kind of thinking is we also really need to figure out how to listen better and listen better in a way that can validate and genuinely understand how someone feels. And this is a journey for me, right? Because I don't experience discrimination. I'm kind of right bang in the middle of privilege. So I've learned a lot by actually listening a lot more and understanding those feelings. And that's a separate conversation to the content and the theories and the arguments and the facts and all that kind of thing. But we've got to get better at that listening phase because I think what that does, the foundation of any good disagreement is social capital, trust and respect and affection and the glue that can bind us together and the bridges that we can build between communities. And so when I teach critical thinking now, I don't talk about this kind of marketplace of ideas thing where we've just got to put out better arguments. I talk about how to listen better, how to hear people, how to validate feelings, how to build that trust, how to express a little bit of vulnerability, to go on a journey together to understand something rather than just trying to win an argument.
What about when people aren't coming? It seems like what you're saying completely, very insightful, completely agree. But what if, it seems like it's on the assumption that people are coming from the same place of equity.
Or good faith.
Yeah, in good faith.
Yeah.
Well, how do you respond to when people have different amounts of equity? How does that, what's a bad argument in a context where people are necessarily maybe not being heard and don't have the power to be heard? Look at the Black Lives Matter movement.
Well, what changed my mind about the marketplace of ideas was...
I just threw that out there.
When I started... Well, it featured a lot in my more naive kind of philosophical thinking.
Not believe in
is when I really started to factor in power and how power changes things. And that's what you're talking about in terms of equity and different voices and marginalisation. And suddenly all of that work that philosophers have done for thousands of years trying to get to the moral truth suddenly just looks hollow, because where were they coming from? What positions did they have? What power did they have?
Can I just come in and just to bring it back to Zoe's question and the implication of that question that somehow it is wrong to express a patriotism. The ideas that you're talking about, that the plurality of ideas and the ability to have discussion, is that not rooted in just the type of thinkers you were talking about before, the David Humes of the world, the Enlightenment thinkers? Is that not a Western inheritance?
Yeah, there's an element where, for most of human history, you were born into a moral community and you didn't choose. You didn't get to choose your social role, you didn't get to choose your power, you didn't get to choose what you agreed with and disagreed with and liked. And there have been varying degrees in some communities of allowing diversity, but really the push through liberalism, the push through John Locke and people like that was to say, we are now at a scale of society where big groups are bumping into each other with different views and they're killing each other over it. I mean, people have been killing each other over these things for a long time, but the scale of it was so great. We need some different ways of thinking about this. Their way of thinking wasn't perfect, but what it did do is introduce an idea of diversity and tolerance as being a norm rather than eliminating diversity and tolerance.
Hence, we can have this conversation. Our next question comes from Angus Murray.
In Juliet, Capulet and Lady Macbeth, Shakespeare gave us two women who, if not for the tragedy of their husbands, whose downfall dragged them down as well, could have been incredibly powerful and were incredibly intelligent. Though, after the Taming of the Shrews, Shakespeare is often dismissed as archaic and misogynistic, do you think that these two leading ladies suggest otherwise? And could this be a product of the Elizabethan era, one led by a formidable woman herself?
Bri.
Well, Nakkiah and I looked up some of the stats, actually, and a bunch of academics did the numbers. And in Shakespeare, apparently only 17% of acts of speech are by women characters. Over 80% are by men, and then there is obviously a small percentage of chorus or
They're
group lines.
incredibly memorable, though, aren't they? I mean, if you think about the characters that immediately spring to mind, the female characters of Cleopatra, Desdemona, Lady Macbeth, Juliet, they may not be saying a lot, but they're certainly memorable.
Yeah, you know what, though? I am not going to feel like we've achieved equality until women have just as much right as men to be mediocre. There are many different ways of dehumanising someone. One option is to put them in a gutter, and another option is to put them on a pedestal. And I think I would agree with the statement that some of Shakespeare's characters, a very small number of them, are women, and some of that small number of women characters are quite incredible. But that doesn't mean we're seeing a huge body of work in which women are human beings in the same way that men get to be human beings.
Paul, would we have expected anything more? I mean, this is a time, of course, when women weren't playing the female roles, that men were playing the female roles when Shakespeare was writing these
I think
plays.
that's the important factor, that he was writing for an all-male company. Women weren't allowed on stage. And so the fact that he was writing these incredible roles like Rosalind, Cleopatra, Portia in The Merchant of Venice, extraordinary roles, very empathetic, very understanding of the way women think and behave, to be played by boys and young men. That's another extraordinary achievement. And I think, you know, the odds were against him writing any women's roles at all. And he was one of the few writers who did. I mean, look at the other writers of the period, Johnson, Webster, Ford. Women hardly exist at all in those plays, or else there's stereotypes or caricatures, but none of them had the insight or the empathy to create such wonderful roles that have been, you know, played by great actresses for the last 400 years. So I think, you know, the plays you mention, Juliet and Lady Macbeth, I think Juliet has extraordinary courage. Remember, she's 13 years old, and her courage and her passion are remarkable. Lady Macbeth's given a bad rap, I think. She was an ambitious woman, but she's not a fiend, she's not a monster. She crumbles very quickly, whereas Macbeth goes on to do worse and worse things because she's a very sensitive and guilt-stricken creature. So I think they are wonderful characters, and, you know, an achievement for a writer writing for an all-male company.
Paul?
Well, yeah, no, I agree with John. He was a product of his time. You know, so 17%. It'd be great to get those numbers up, but we're not going to get them.
Well, we've got Nakkiah writing now.
But actually, we do get them up. Sorry, because he might have only written 17% of the roles for women, but there was a Bell Shakespeare production in which Hamlet was played by a woman, or was scheduled to happen.
Yeah.
One of the performances, live theatre performances, that people speak with in absolutely tones of hush and awe was when Kate Mulvaney played, was it Richard III?
Yeah.
There is, that's what I would like to use as an example of holding two thoughts at once, to come back to the theme of the episode, apparently, is that if you are going to choose to put Shakespeare on again, despite how much it is here and how much it has been redone over the centuries, I think it is right to call out if it is not done with sufficient imagination and reinvention to drag it into the 21st century. And we are starting to see some really great examples of that happening, but it's not yet the norm.
Oh, I'd say it is very much the norm. Bell Shakespeare productions, you mentioned they were both Bell Shakespeare, Richard III and Hamlet, and we also had an all-female Taming of the Shrew. So it's becoming very much a fact that you have to have gender balance within a company, if not an all-female company.
Great, so it's the norm at Bell Shakespeare.
Oh, I'd say look around the country, look around the world, you'll find it's very much the norm everywhere.
Okay.
Not just gender bending, but colour-blind casting, gender-blind casting is now absolutely established as, that's where you have to go.
All right.
Let's go to our next question from Diana Minglis.
Much has been said about the toxicity of Twitter, but isn't it just filling the vacuum that has been left through the absence of an effective fourth estate holding our leaders to account following the changes in media ownership laws? Aren't memes just the political cartoons and citizen reporters just the investigative journalists of the modern era?
Yeah, Paul, we're living in an era where someone with a phone can be a filmmaker, a photographer, someone with a blog can be a journalist. And the democratisation of voices, while it can be a rough space, we're hearing from a lot of people that we didn't hear from before.
Well, that's very true, and I think some of them, most of them, we shouldn't be hearing from. It gets overwhelming. At the moment, there's an incredible tirade that's happening with David Chappelle and Hannah Gadsby.
Whether Dave Chappelle should be cancelled. He'd said some things about Hannah Gadsby not particularly being funny, I think was one of the references.
He wasn't funny, which is an old trope about women, and it's incredibly offensive. Hannah is an extraordinary writer. I think we should be proud of her and her work. Nanette was a global sensation. But comedy, like all the arts we're talking about, it's very subjective. You like what you like and certain people don't. And having one of the most powerful male comics in the world sort of punching down at Hannah, I think is phenomenal. And that has awoken all these people on Twitter who are agreeing with him. Not a lot of comedians I've noticed or people that actually know her work. A lot of it is just people attacking, and it's pretty vile. But he's given it air and it will keep going for quite some time.
Is this, Tim, are you familiar with the Dave Chappelle furor at the moment? And
I've avoided it as much as I can. I mean, yes, I'm familiar with it because it's everywhere, but Is
it someone being an agent provocateur, do you think? Is it deliberately... Is he trying to make a point about how far can I go before I get cancelled to make a point about cancel culture?
On his particular thing because I've only got enough bandwidth. And so I pick my Twitter battles to follow, and that one I chose not to. I've been following many other things. But I think these kinds of... It's not just them talking, it's millions of other people talking. And that's what's changed now. That's what's changed with social media. And as Paul said, maybe a lot of those people we shouldn't be speaking of. Now, I don't know how you would measure it, but I'd suggest that like Twitter is probably a net loss for humanity. For the good things that it's enabled, for the democratisation, for the revolutions perhaps that it's influenced, I think there's been so much toxic discourse that's been put on there. And part of that is because it's built in a way to push our brains' buttons, to feed our desire for outrage and doom.
You say we're addicted to outrage.
We are addicted,
book,
yeah, we're addicted to it. So I talk a lot about, like, the way we evolved and, like, you know, we got, like, a sweet tooth. We can blame our primates for that. And that probably wasn't so bad, our primate ancestors for that, but it wasn't so bad for them. It was really hard for them to get obese. But we're now in an environment surrounded buy sweet treats. It's really hard. We have to stop ourselves, and we're not very good at using willpower to stop it.
I don't often do that, I've got to say.
Yeah, but the same thing has occurred with outrage. Outrage is a very powerful moral emotion that encourages us to call out wrongdoing and intervene and stop it. But when it's on social media, we are flooded with a torrent of outrageous events. And we don't have, it pushes our buttons, but we don't have the same means to actually do anything positive about it.
Bri, are we flooded by it, or does it seem like it? Do we hear, is it so loud, the anger on there, that we hear, that we miss everything else that's happening, and we miss the voices that are being heard that don't always get heard? We miss the civility, we miss the genuine conversation because it is drowned out by what may be at the extremes, a lot of the noise. I wonder about that.
I think the power of the internet to allow previously disempowered and disenfranchised individuals to collectivise is something that we cannot afford to underestimate, ever. What I believe is that there is an overdue conversation about the toxicity of something like, let's use Twitter specifically, but also social media more generally. Yes, individuals behave in a toxic way towards each other. I'm much more interested in asking who are the multi-billionaires who create toxic environments to foster the worst in us. And the evidence that's coming out, especially in America at the moment, in Senate
Facebook.
About Facebook, and the fact that it's not an accidental or unfortunate byproduct of Facebook that people get toxic with each other. That is a core component of the way it operates. The toxicity for young people, young women in particular, but young people in general, about body image and the use of Instagram, that's not an accidental, unfortunate byproduct. That is a part of the modus operandi of these huge businesses that make a small number of people an extreme amount of money. If we're going to talk about toxicity of social media, let's actually pick the big guys up top instead of taking each other down.
Yeah, like outrage is being commodified. I don't necessarily think we've been addicted to it, because I think if you're from a marginalised community, you have a lot to be outraged by. And things on like social media, the solidarity and the voice that you can find there is a really good tool in order to create change. And we've seen that through things like the solidarity around the world with Black Lives Matter. And then when we say it's toxic to who? Because I just want to say, in speaking, you talked about Dave Chappelle and being like, has Dave Chappelle been cancelled? Dave Chappelle is a very rich man who got paid to do that Netflix comedy, talking about trans people. Now, we talk about, what is the ramifications in real life?
Is it cancelling or is it just accountability?
Is it accountability? Because essentially, he was punching down on trans people. The most vulnerable trans people are trans people of colour, our brothers and sisters stand, who he was punching down on. So who cares if he's cancelled? Who cares if the discourse around him is toxic? Because the people who actually have to live the ramifications of that type of hate speech, that's inequality.
And actually, the only person I'm aware of that's actually been cancelled in terms of losing their job, wasn't it a trans-identifying person who worked at Netflix who leaked the documents to try and bring attention to the situation?
Nakkiah, you found yourself in a situation recently, didn't you? And I wanted to just explore this and the sequence of events with the Pauline Hanson interview done by Jessica Rowe, and I believe you were one of a few people who had said, who had criticised that. That was subsequently taken down. But then what happened afterwards?
So I had a conversation with, it was really funny because about a week earlier I'd had a few wines and been like, I'm taking down my Twitter because I haven't been on for ages, because I do think in a way, for myself, as someone with a platform, it can be a really toxic place to be, but it has its value. So when we go, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, the same can be said for social media. I think we throw these buzzwords around toxic, and it's what does it actually mean? What is the lived reality of people engaging with these mediums? But how that kind of went down is Jessica Rowe is a very dear, a friend of mine, someone who I very much respect. I did a podcast with Pauline Hanson. There was a lot of criticism online, so I thought, okay, I wrote one tweet. I think it was 2 tweets, very, for me, I thought it was fairly calm and articulate. I just said, look, I don't know if this is necessarily what you... Do you want to associate yourself with this?
Did you want her to take it down?
No, I said, it's up to you. I said, maybe you take it down, but really it's up to you. But here is my opinion. Let's have a discourse about it. Anyway, Jess ended up making the decision to take the podcast down, which was her decision. But then what ensued was that outrage commodification. It was on the news. There were. Mainly, I feel like getting nervous even talking about this because I don't know what the onslaught's going to be. I guess more conservative right-wing media. For 2 tweets, I really thought, like, out of everything that I've done in my career, that would be the least a kind of thing that would get attention. And I had people send me messages. I can pull out my phone and read some of them. You get called an abo, an idiot, a piece of shit. That was one of the. That's what I've like. That's that. That's that kind of outrage commodification. I did not expect it, and it really took me by surprise.
And people accusing you of also engaging
of censorship, and it's like I didn't like it.
But did Pauline Hanson just?
Well, I think what we need to remember though is censorship is something that's
have...
done by a government. I think we're allowed to go, hey, you did something, I don't agree. Also, that's not censorship. You can't. That's just someone disagreeing with you. And I think out of all people, Pauline Hanson should be, the leniency she takes over people's rights. She should be. The word she throws at other people, she should be able to take it.
But you weren't saying take it down. You would have been happy for it
I suggested. I said maybe you should, but it's up to you. But what ended up happening was, and this is when I want to go to cancel culture, the way we use this in outrage, as if these are new things. I sat in the shower one morning and I was crying because I'd been getting these messages saying that was worthless, I should kill myself, all these things. And I sat in my shower. I'm in my 30s. I'm a fairly privileged person, and I cried. I didn't want to exist. I've struggled with self-harm and depression my entire life. From when kids would call me the fat abo and throw their fruit at me off the bus at school. And I sat there. And what I did is I went on social media and I just started writing because, this is like, that was the only thing I could do is this is my voice, you're not going to take it away. And I don't know, and the response I got was really overwhelming and if I hadn't gone to social media, I wouldn't have gotten that response. But then I thought, hey, like these feelings of feeling worthless, of people calling you names, these aren't new, Nakkiah. I spoke to my parents. I'm sure you have as well, Stan. They've also had those things. They've said to me, my mum has said to me, a woman in her 60s who has had a rich career, amazing person. She said, sometimes I feel worthless as an Aboriginal person in this country, and I too have thought about self-harm. So this thing of like outrage and cancel culture exists because we live in a colonial nation that is built on cancelling people. It's just I think what we do is we see marginal people and we call them a cultural problem when they dare to say anything back.
Well, those things don't define you, and I think you know that. And those people don't define you.
Well, to an extent, though, they do. That is, to an extent. I'm the only person here on the Q&A website where they have maybe except for you, sorry, Stan, where on this panel today, they said a Gomeroi Torres Strait Islander woman. I'm not ashamed of being Aboriginal, but we're defined by colonial people, by whiteness, telling us that we're Aboriginal. We don't call, white Mr. John Bell. I can if you like. But it's like, why? So this idea that we get to pick in and out of these things that define us, I don't think it's necessarily correct. It gives us way more autonomy then.
I might just finish with you, Paul.
Sorry.
No, thank you. Thank you, Chair. I may just speak to you, Paul, just as someone who's a satirist as well. How do you navigate that line between what is outrage, what is genuinely a cause of outrage and rightful outrage, and what is toxic, what is hateful?
I've never experienced anything like what Nakkiah is talking about. I'm once again an example of privilege. I've had an extraordinary easy run through life. As someone I get up on stage, I don't feel terrified of speaking my mind when I'm on stage. I don't worry if I upset people, but I don't come from a different, culture. I just do what I do. But it's very different for other people on the in this group. And we all approach it differently. We all try and overcome. We all try and express our art, and expressing art and sharing it is what I think we're all trying to do, and trying to get to a better point with humanity, all of humanity, even the people that are a bit.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, like, this is really, I think it was a column by Bolt, I think, where he quoted a role that Deb Melbourne plays in the ABC TV show Total Control. And instead of saying that the character said this quote, he said it as Deb Mailman said that quote. That's very clearly taken out of context. That's happened to me, where I've been in comedy sketches and the stuff that I've said is attributed to me as saying that.
Rather than the performance or
as
role.
a performance. And that's what I mean. I think there needs to be a lot of accountability to the media companies who are commodifying that outrage and being able to create division and not allow people. We're talking a lot about duality and complexity to people. I think, you know, we really still are fighting for that, a lot of people.
Well, thank you all so much. It's been a fantastic conversation, and thank you, Nakkiah, for being able to share some of those stories. And as hard as those stories are to share, I'm sorry to hear them. We want to leave you with a theatrical performance tonight. Just before that, as I say, thanks again to our panel: Paul McDermott, Nakkiah Lui, John Bell, Bri Lee, and Tim Dean. Remember, you can hear John Bell's Boyer Lectures every Sunday in November. That's on ABCRN and via the ABC Listen app. And thank you all for your questions as well. Next week, Virginia Trioli will be with you live from Melbourne. I want to leave you now, though, with this special performance. Zahra Newman performing a scene from Sydney Theatre Company's upcoming production of Julius Caesar. Here, she is playing the role of Brutus.
Then gather here and give me audience, friends. Those that will hear me speak, let him stay here, and public reasons shall be rendered of Caesar's death. Be patient till the last. Romans, countrymen and lovers, hear me for my cause and be silent, that you may hear. Believe me for mine honor and have respect to mine honor, that you may believe. Censure me in your wisdom and awaken your senses, that you may the better judge. If there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than his. If then that friend demand why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. Had you rather Caesar were living and die all slaves than that Caesar were dead to live all free men? As Caesar loved me, I weep for him. As he was fortunate, I rejoice in it. As he was valiant, I honor him. But as he was ambitious, I slew him. There is tears for his love, joy for his fortune, honor for his valor, and death for his ambition. Who is here so base that would be a bondman? If any, speak, for him have I offended. Who is here so rude that would not be a Roman? If any, speak, for him have I offended. Who is here so vile that would not love his country? If any, speak, for him have I offended. I pause for a reply. Then none have I offended. I have done no more to Caesar than you shall do to Brutus. The question of his death is enrolled in the Capitol, his glory not extenuated, wherein he was worthy, nor his offences enforced, for which he suffered death. Here comes his body, mourned by Mark Antony, who, though he had no hand in his death, shall receive the benefit of his dying, a place in the commonwealth, as which of you shall not? With this I depart, that as I slew my best lover for the good of Rome, I have the same dagger for myself when it shall please my country to need my death.